They told me to leave the house quietly, so I sold it while they slept upstairs. It wasn't a yell or a fight. It was my daughter-in-law standing at the bottom of the stairs, her arms folded, her voice sugar-dipped and firm. She said it was for the best if I left without making it a thing. My son stood behind her, eyes on the tiles, like a child who'd knocked over a vase and didn't want to look at the mess. They had already packed 2 boxes for me. My clothes folded wrong, my books tossed in with shoes. On top of it all sat a yellow envelope with my name scribbled in blue ink. No return address, just a date they'd chosen. I'm so glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far this story travels. You should know something about me. I didn't start as the kind of woman who folds. I was strong once, stronger than they ever saw. When my husband died, I didn't cry at the funeral. I stood tall in a navy blue coat and kept my arms around the children like a fortress. My son was 15. My daughter had just turned 11. They held my hands like ropes in a flood. I went back to work the week after we buried him, payroll clerk at a tire company. Not glamorous, but it fed them, clothed them, kept the lights on. I made tuna casserole stretch for nights and washed clothes by hand when the machine broke. My fingers cracked from bleach. My back ached from standing, but they never went without. Never once. I used to sleep beside the window so I could see the driveway in case my daughter snuck out. I kept a flashlight by the bed for storms and a copy of the insurance policy in the freezer, wrapped in a Ziploc next to the peas. I remember things like that, strange things. The way the doorknob clicked when my son came home late. The way my daughter's voice sounded when she was lying. They were everything. My whole map. I never remarried, never even dated. I was too busy being everything for them. Mother, father, cook, driver, tutor, nurse, warden. Soft place to land. But somewhere along the way, the thanks stopped coming. Not abruptly, just faded. They grew up and away. And I told myself it was normal. You raise them to fly, right? You're not supposed to keep them in the nest. That's what I told myself each Christmas, when plans changed last minute. Each birthday, when the card came late, or not at all. When I turned 65, my son and his wife suggested I move in with them. Said the house was too big for me. Too many stairs. Said I'd be safer in their guest room. Said I wouldn't have to worry about snow removal, groceries, anything. Sounded kind. It even felt kind. For a while, I moved in on a Sunday in October. The leaves were still stubbornly green. I remember because I'd wanted to stay long enough to see them turn. But they insisted. Said winter came fast that year. I gave up my home, my rose garden, my reading chair by the front window. I left behind my piano because there was no space for it. I told myself I could adjust. That this was what aging gracefully looked like, letting go. At first, it wasn't terrible. The guest room had a view of the back fence, little window with morning light. I set my books on the shelf, laid my quilt across the bed. I was still cooking then. My son loved my pot roast, and I helped fold laundry, picked up the kids. From school when they were running late, I felt useful. But things shifted slowly. They always do, Tappard. First, it was small corrections. I was putting the forks in the wrong drawer. I used too much detergent. The kids were tired of my stories. Then it became space. My books were boxed up and put in the garage. The quilt got replaced with a cleaner-looking coverlet. My knitting bag disappeared for weeks. My son said he thought I'd given it away. The kitchen became off-limits. I was told to rest more. They hired a housekeeper. She had a key. I didn't. Calls from old friends went unanswered because the phone was always on silent or missing. The landline they promised never got installed. When I asked, they said no one uses landlines anymore. Then came the pills. My daughter-in-law started bringing them in a little cup each morning. Said they were to help me sleep, help my joints, help me not worry so much. I didn't question it. I should have. She started speaking slowly to me, like I was hard of hearing, like I was confused. Sometimes she'd smile at me, not kindly. But like I was someone whose mistakes were predictable. I began to feel invisible in my own life. The children would run past me, not through me. My son stopped saying goodnight. My daughter-in-law started using words like transition plan. At dinner, they'd talk about me like I wasn't there. Sentences beginning with, when she's no longer able. One night, I found a sticky note on the fridge that said, call elder care attorney, underlined twice. That was when I started writing things down. I bought a notebook from the corner store near the pharmacy. It's just $1.30. Blue cover, spiral spine. I kept it under my pillow. Every whisper, every comment, every date, I wrote it down. The envelope came a week after the sticky note. That yellow one, folded over, with my name in blue. I kept it unopened for 2 days. I told myself it couldn't be bad. I told myself they wouldn't. But they did. Inside was a notice. Not legal, not yet, but firm. They had arranged for me to be relocated, the word they used, nice assisted living place, they said. My name had been added to the waiting list. The deposit had already been paid. All I had to do was cooperate. I wasn't mad. Not yet. Just hollow. I placed the envelope on the nightstand. I stared at it all night, the way you stare at a ceiling fan that won't turn off. Quietly hating the motion, but unable to stop it. They told me to leave the house quietly, so I started planning something they would never hear coming. The morning. After I read that envelope, I made scrambled eggs just to feel the weight of a warm pan in my hand again. No one joined me in the kitchen. My daughter-in-law had already fed the kids, and my son had gone out for a jog. I moved slowly, deliberately, setting a place for myself at the corner of the table, the one spot that still got the sunlight if you timed it right. I used the floral plate from the back of the cabinet, the one they thought I wouldn't notice missing. I remembered bringing that plate back from Portugal decades ago, when life was still wide and my hair was still thick enough to hold curlers. I chewed in silence, and I didn't rush. The note in my pocket made my spine heavy, but my hands were steady. I was steady. It's strange how your own child can start looking at you like a task, like you are something to be managed. I think the shift begins before either of you notice. You start as a hero, then become a helper, and then slowly, quietly, you become excess. I used to be the woman who fixed things. I patched their knees and their fears. I sewed buttons and wrote excuse notes. I was the one they called when someone broke their heart or the car wouldn't start. My phone used to ring at midnight, and I'd answer without a second thought. I remember once when my son was in college, he called me crying. He had failed a test, a big one, said he wasn't cut out for the pressure. Told him he could cry for one night, but in the morning, he had to try again. I stayed on the phone until I heard him fall asleep. The next day, he passed the retake. Years later, he would forget to mention me in a speech, thanking everyone who helped him become who he was. I sat in the front row, hands folded in my lap, smiling because that's what mothers are trained to do, to be proud even when it stings. That night, cried alone in a hotel bathroom with the faucet running, but I never mentioned it. My daughter, well, she had her own ideas about family. She moved 3 states away, started using phrases like emotional labor and generational boundaries. She told people she raised herself that I was distant. She sent me articles about elder self-sufficiency as birthday gifts. Last, I heard she was attending retreats in the desert to process her girlhood. It's funny, isn't it? How the sacrifices you made quietly become the reasons you're resented. You give them everything. Then they accuse you of not keeping enough for yourself. They ask where your identity is, as if it's a coat you should have kept in a closet. The truth is, my identity was always stitched into theirs. And maybe that was my mistake. The house I left behind was small, but mine. Every corner of it held a memory. It's a pink bathroom tile I never replaced because my daughter once said it looked like candy. The squeaky step on the stairs I never fixed because it let me know when someone was sneaking down for snacks. The back fence I painted alone the summer my son moved out. I remember crying as I brushed the paint, pretending it was sweat in my eyes. I held on to that house through layoffs, through a breast cancer scare, through 2 hurricanes and 3 winters where the furnace nearly gave out. I kept the pipes from freezing. I mowed my own lawn until my knees begged me not to. I hosted Christmas dinners and summer birthdays. And every stain on the carpet had a story. But when they offered to relieve me of the burden, I believed. Then they said it was time for me to rest, that I'd earned it. I shouldn't have to worry anymore, so I signed it away. Signed away my last piece of ground. My last door with a lock that I owned. And now here I was, a guest with no key. I became someone who needed to knock. Someone who asked permission to cook, to sit, to open windows. I stopped buying groceries because they said it messed with their meal plan. I stopped watching my shows because the grandkids said the volume was too loud. I stopped calling old friends because I didn't want them to hear the hollowness in my voice when they asked how I was. You start to disappear in small pieces first. They laugh when you forget something and then they remind you. Twice. Then they start finishing your sentences for you, kindly, of course. Then the important conversations happen without you. Until one day, you realize no one's asking you anything anymore. I wasn't stupid. I saw the signs. The gentle infantilizing. The way my daughter-in-law moved my pills around. The way my son said, "Don't worry about it, Mom, we've got it handled." Whenever I asked about bills or mail or taxes, he never used to call me Mom. I was always Mama, until I wasn't. I wish. I could say it was a single moment that broke me, but it wasn't. It was 100 soft cuts. 1,000 daily rejections, so quiet they echoed. But I remember the moment I stopped letting it happen. It was a Wednesday. The air smelled like lilac from the neighbor's bushes. My joints ached from the cold, and I had a sore spot on my heel from the slippers I'd been wearing too long. My daughter-in-law asked me, kindly, politely, if I would mind not sitting in the living room so early. Said the kids found it unsettling to wake up and see me there. She laughed when she said it, but it wasn't kind. That was the moment I realized they didn't want me here. Not really. They wanted the idea of me. The virtue of taking me in. The ability to tell people they were caring for Mom while they slowly erased me, smile by smile, request by request. That evening, I asked for a new copy of the house deed. I said I'd misplaced it. They didn't know I had scanned it years ago, okay? That I'd kept a notarized copy in a folder marked receipts in the bottom of my file cabinet, okay? That I'd made no changes when I moved out, not legally. I still owned that house. They had never bothered to check. They assumed, like most people do, that old women don't know how to read between the lines. I went to sleep that night with my notebook under my pillow and the faintest curl of strength returning to my spine. They told me to leave quietly, but I remembered who I was before they asked. It's a strange thing. How erasure doesn't come with a bang. It doesn't announce itself. It arrives with softness, the kind you mistake for care. It starts when someone moves your toothbrush. It's just an inch to the left, but not where you left it. Then your robe is folded differently, not your way. Then someone buys a different brand of tea, says yours was hard to find. And suddenly, you're not choosing anymore. You're adjusting. One morning, I came down to find the kitchen clock had been changed. A sleek black thing with no numbers, just lines. The one I brought from my old house, gold-rimmed with Roman numerals, was nowhere. When I asked, my daughter-in-law said it must have fallen and broken. There was no mess, no glass, no mention from anyone else. That clock had hung in my kitchen since 1989. My husband picked it out. Kay said it reminded him of the train station where we kissed the first time. It didn't just tell time, it held it. And just like that, it was gone. I told myself it wasn't worth making a fuss. But I felt the change. They called it streamlining. They were always making things easier. But easier for who? I stopped leaving my coffee mug in the sink. I started rinsing and drying it immediately, placing it back on the same shelf each time. a habit I never used to have. I used to take my time, but I began to shrink my movements, my presence, my voice. One afternoon, I heard my name spoken, softly behind the closed kitchen door. I paused at the top of the stairs. My daughter-in-law's voice was calm, almost amused. She said something about how I was drifting and how it was only a matter of time. My son said nothing. For a moment, then he sighed and said maybe the doctor should make it official next visit that I was showing signs. Signs of what? Exactly. I held the railings so tight I left nail marks in the wood. I didn't breathe until I heard her walk out. The back door and the screen slapped behind her. That night, sat with my notebook open and a pen in my lap for a long time before I wrote anything down. When I finally did, I only wrote 4 words. They are rewriting me. And that's what it felt like. Like someone had taken the story of my life and begun to edit it, cut pieces out, move the commas, make it neater, make it fit into their frame. My son began introducing me differently in front of people. At a PTA meeting, he called me his aging mother, who lives with them now. There was an edge of pride in his voice, but the kind you reserve for a project you're managing. Well, I wasn't a person. I was a task completed. When neighbors stopped by, I was ushered upstairs with a gentle hand on my back. They said I needed rest, that I preferred quiet. My daughter-in-law joked about how I got cranky without my nap. I never took naps, but the narrative took root. The children began treating me like furniture, present, useful at times, but never consulted. They stopped asking if I wanted to come along to the store, to the park, to the school recital. One day I asked my granddaughter how her choir concert went, and she looked surprised and said, "I thought you were too tired to come." No one had told me it was happening. The invitations dried up, like petals in a forgotten vase. The worst part wasn't the loneliness. It was the confusion, the slow, spiraling question. Am I imagining this? When everyone treats you like you're fragile, you start to question your own weight. I began second-guessing my memories. Did I really remember things the way they happened? Had I been more difficult than I thought? Had I missed signs of my own decline? I started keeping grocery receipts and writing dates in the margins of magazines. It's just to remind myself that I was still moving forward. That time still passed through my hands, even if no one else was watching. One afternoon, sat out back in the small corner of yard they hadn't claimed with furniture or toys. I watched an ant crawl over a leaf for a full 10 minutes. It wasn't doing anything remarkable, just living, moving from one place to the next without apology or explanation. I envied that. That same day, saw a group of women walking past the fence. One of them looked like June from the old neighborhood. We used to do potlucks once a month and trade jellies in fall. She looked over at the house, squinted, and then kept walking. No one waved. Later, I asked my son if anyone from my old life had tried to call. He shrugged and said he thought they'd all moved on. I hadn't, but they had made sure it looked that way. I stopped wearing my nicer sweaters, the ones I used to save for brunches or coffee dates. There were no outings to dress up for. No one to see me once. I put on lipstick before dinner, just to feel a little alive. My daughter-in-law tilted her head and said, "Ah, that's cute, cute." It was the same tone I used to use when the kids dressed the dog in sunglasses. That night, I scrubbed the color off my lips until the tissue came. Back-stained pink and raw. Still, I didn't cry. Not yet. I felt something brewing beneath the quiet, a kind of settling. Like when a storm is coming but hasn't cracked the sky open yet, I started to notice little things again. Their patterns, what time they left the house, how long they stayed gone, where they placed the mail, who knocked on the door, what keys they used. I was shrinking in their eyes, but I was sharpening in my own. The more they erased me, the clearer I became. They didn't know I had memory like thread, fine but strong, that I could piece together timelines from glances, phrases, the way someone wiped a crumb off the table. They didn't know. I was writing. They didn't know I was still listening. And they certainly didn't know that, quietly, invisibly, I had already begun making space for something else. Not revenge. Not even justice. Just truth. And that I've learned. It's the most dangerous thing to a family built on illusion. It crept in softly, the isolation. At first I told myself it was seasonal. A bad stretch of weather, a few too many rainy afternoons in a row. I'd sit on the edge of the bed, knitting needles resting on my lap, and convince myself I was just adjusting. But loneliness is clever. It doesn't announce itself in one loud thud. It arrives like a draft under the door. A slow, chilling presence that you only notice once the room is too cold to fix. I remember when I realized I hadn't spoken to another adult outside of this house in weeks. It hit me on a Thursday. The coffee pot was gurgling behind me, and I had reached for a second mug out of habit. Then I froze, realizing there was no one else I was expecting. No one I could even call. The phone book I'd brought from my old place was stuffed in the bottom drawer of my nightstand. Most of the numbers in it were dead ends now. People moved past or slowly let the line go quiet over the years. I picked up the phone anyway, dialed June's number. A man answered. Said I had the wrong house. His voice was kind but final. I didn't try another number. I used to have a garden club, book group. I was always the one who brought lemon. Bars, that's what they called me. I wonder if anyone ever noticed when I stopped showing up. Or if they heard I had moved in with my son and assumed I was happy and cared for, like a retired cat. Curled up in some sunny corner, it's funny how people assume proximity equals love, but living in the same house doesn't mean you're part of it. You can be an echo in the walls and still not be heard. The kids started treating me like wallpaper. I was background, smiled at them, made space, offered snacks. They nodded, took, walked away. Sometimes they called me Nana. Sometimes, not at all. One night I came downstairs and found my granddaughter watching TV on the couch. I sat beside her, careful not to startle her, and asked if she wanted to hear a story about when her dad was her age. She didn't look away from the screen, just said, maybe later, I'm busy. I watched her face glow with the flicker of cartoons and realized I wasn't even competition for her attention. I was just extra. Optional like that week. My son suggested gently that I spend more time in my room to give the kids space. He said it like it was temporary, like it was for everyone's comfort. But it felt like being benched from a life I helped build. I obeyed, I always obeyed. They said I was resting too much. Then said I looked tired. Then said I should get out. More but never once invited me anywhere. I stopped sitting in the backyard. My chair had been taken over by a pile of outdoor cushions they never stored properly. The cushion I once used, blue with a little tear in the seam, had been thrown out. I found the scraps in the side bin one morning. The garage clicker I used to keep was missing from my dresser. I asked about it once. My daughter-in-law laughed and said, "Oh, did you really need it?" I told her it didn't matter. But it did. Piece by piece, they were closing the doors of my life. One by one, I tried to talk to my son about it once. Told him I was feeling a little disconnected. He nodded like I'd said the weather might rain and told me not to take things personally. He said, "Mom, you're just not used to sharing space." He didn't understand. I'd been sharing space my entire life with his father. With them, with neighbors, co-workers, community. I'd shared until I didn't know what was mine anymore. And now they were telling me I was the one who needed adjusting. What no one tells you is that a mother doesn't stop being a mother. Just because she's no longer needed, the instincts don't dull. The desire to comfort, to connect, to belong, it stays sharp. But it hurts like a knife with nowhere to cut. Some evenings, I'd sit at the small desk by the window and write letters I never sent. To my late husband, to my sister, to women I hadn't spoken to in years. I'd write about the quiet, strangeness of having so much time and no place to put it. The ache of being surrounded by people and still feeling invisible. I began to fear my own silence. that if I didn't say something soon, I might forget how to speak at all. But every time I thought about confronting them, I stopped myself. I pictured their faces, patient, tired, indulgent. My son with that sigh that says I'm overreacting. My daughter-in-law with her soft, syrupy voice explaining that I'm just not used to modern family dynamics. It would end the way it always did, with me apologizing for a feeling, so I kept it in. One night I heard laughter from the dining room. Real laughter. The kind that echoes. I crept to the top of the stairs and watched them through the banister. They were playing a board game. My granddaughter threw her head back and giggled. My son was pretending to be serious. My daughter-in-law was tucking her feet up on the chair like she always did when she was cozy, and I wasn't there. Not missed. Not even mentioned. That was when it hit me. I was no longer part of their joy. I had been gently pushed to the perimeter. And the circle had closed without me. It wasn't a door slammed shut. It was a door never opened. That night I sat in the dark and turned the idea over in my head like a smooth stone. If they didn't see me, if I made no sound, if I vanished, would they notice? The answer came too quickly, so I started noticing instead. I started watching the way the mail piled up. Before it was sorted. Which days they left their keys on the entry table. How often the property tax envelope came unopened. I began logging it all, not out of malice, but out of clarity, because I needed to remember that I was still capable of seeing, of knowing, of being right, about things they had taken away my voice in the family, but they hadn't taken my eyes, and they hadn't taken my name. Off the deed. Not yet. It started with a misdelivered envelope. That's how these things often begin. Not with a scream, but with a simple mistake. A piece of mail that should have gone to my son ended up on my dresser. Addressed to him, yes, but the last name was mine. The full name. The one I hadn't legally changed when I married, even though I used his name for everything else. No one ever noticed that detail except the bank. It was a quarterly update from a mortgage company I didn't recognize. I almost didn't open it. Almost just left it on the entry table like everything else. Okay. But something about it, the way my name was used, the tiny return address in the corner felt too familiar. So I did what I wasn't supposed to do anymore. I opened it. Inside, there was a statement. Loan activity, principal balance, current equity estimate. And on the third line, the address, my house. The one I'd left behind, it's the one they told me, was taken care of, but the loan wasn't in my name. It was in his, my son. I read the paper 3 times before I could even process what I was seeing. Then I folded it again, too neatly, and placed it back in the envelope like I was putting a bird back into a broken cage. He had taken out a second mortgage on my house. Months ago, I sat down on the bed and let the afternoon light fall across my knees. My hands felt foreign, like they belonged to someone else, someone trembling. I wasn't confused. I wasn't tired. I wasn't emotional. I was betrayed. The house had been paid off for 6 years before I moved out. I remember making the last payment, wrote a check in thick blue ink, and took a photo of myself holding it. I'd laminated the confirmation letter. It had felt like freedom. They told me the house was too much to keep up with. They said they'd help sell it, help manage it. That it could become a rental, maybe, or a safe place for family one day. I didn't press. I trusted, but they never sold it. They borrowed against it, they kept it in my name, but used it for themselves. And they never told me that evening. I watched the dinner conversation like a stranger. My son talked about refinancing his car. My daughter-in-law joked about vacations they couldn't afford. I passed the peas without a word. I listened with ears that now heard everything differently. After the dishes were done and the kitchen went quiet, I went back upstairs and pulled out the notebook. I wrote down the date of the letter, the loan number, the figure. And then I drew a line beneath it and wrote one sentence. They are living off what I built. For days, I said nothing. I just watched. Mail started arriving more frequently. I checked the stacks when no one was looking. I began to understand their routines. Who checked it, who tossed what, who never looked at anything with numbers on it. Most of the envelopes with the mortgage company's logo went straight into the trash. One evening, I fished one out after dinner. I waited until the house was asleep. I took it into the bathroom, the only room I could lock without suspicion, and read by the overhead light. Another notice. Missed payment. I folded that one up and put it in my nightstand. They were behind. He was behind, and I had no idea how far it had gone. The next day, I walked to the corner store and bought a prepaid phone. Cash only. I told the clerk it was for my niece. He smiled, didn't ask questions. I walked slowly back home, holding the box like a fragile secret. That night, I charged it under my bed and searched for the only lawyer I'd ever known personally. A man named Harold who used to go to church with us. He'd retired, but I remembered he had a son in the same firm. I called the office and left a message. They called me back the next day. I scheduled a meeting, quietly. My daughter-in-law asked where I was going. Kai told her I was meeting someone from church for tea. She didn't even ask who. At the lawyer's office, I brought everything. My notebook, the envelope, the photo of the check I wrote all those years ago, the laminated letter, the documents I'd saved in my own quiet way, tucked into a file marked house. Do not throw. He listened without interruption. He didn't blink when I said they were trying to relocate me. Didn't flinch when I said I was still on the deed. When I asked if they could do what they'd done, he said no, not without my consent. Not legally, not ethically, not quietly. I felt something shift inside me. A breath I hadn't realized I was holding for years. I was still the owner, and now I had proof. We made a plan. Not revenge, protection. I told him I wasn't leaving this house, not yet, that I needed more time, that I wanted to understand how far the rot had spread. He nodded and said something that stayed with me. You're not the one who should be ashamed. Mrs. Khan? No one had called me that in a while. I walked home slower than usual, watching every tree, every mailbox. The world looked sharper, like I'd been seeing it through fogged glass for months, and now, suddenly, everything was in focus. They were stealing from me. They were counting on me not noticing, and they were planning my removal so they could take what I built and say they earned it. But I had the deed, I had the documents, and I had my memory intact, untouched, unwelcome. The next morning, I brewed tea and set out 2 cups. One for me, one for the woman I used to be. I said out loud, softly, I see you. And for the first time in a long time, I felt her nod back. After I left the lawyer's office, I didn't go back to being the same woman who quietly stirred tea and nodded through meals. I still played the part. I still smiled when my daughter-in-law asked if I was sleeping well. And I still thanked my son when he handed me the smallest piece of salmon from the pan. I kept the softness in my voice, the slight shuffle in my walk. I didn't need them to know I was awake because I was more awake than I had been in years. Now I was watching everything. They were used to me being quiet, so they didn't notice the difference between stillness and observation. But I did. Every morning, I watched how the mail was sorted. My daughter-in-law kept anything thick and official looking on the hallway console, pretending it was clutter. I started collecting those when no one was watching. Slipped them into the sleeve of my cardigan, under magazines, into the false bottom of a hat box I kept in the back of the closet. She never touched my things. She thought they didn't matter. Found 3 more letters from the mortgage company, 2 from a property tax office, 1 from a financial planner I didn't recognize with my name misspelled on the envelope. I read them slowly, methodically, like I was digesting a language I'd once been fluent in. Kept every one, dated and logged in my notebook with a blue pen that never left my nightstand drawer. My phone, the prepaid one, stayed off during the day. But at night, I used it to look up names I found in the letters. A broker, a notary, a consultant whose email signature matched one. I saw printed on the corner of a form they left out one night after dinner. He was not a consultant. He was a home transition specialist. Someone you call when you're trying to move an older relative into a better environment. His website had bright pastel graphics and phrases like, "We'll help your loved one feel safe while you focus on what matters." What mattered? Their comfort, their financial cushion, their clean slate. They weren't just borrowing against my house. They were actively preparing to sell it behind my back. The only reason they hadn't already was because I was still on the title, still breathing, still alert, though they pretended otherwise. And yet, they treated me like a child. A gentle suggestion here, a shifted chair there. My clothes slowly replaced with easier options. My books swapped out for magazines about brain health. My name whispered in worried tones when they thought I was napping. I started leaving the light on in my room at odd hours, watching how they reacted. Once, my daughter-in-law poked her head in and asked if I was having trouble sleeping. I told her, evenly, that I preferred the light sometimes, that I'd always slept better that way. She looked at me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes and said, "Of course, whatever makes you comfortable." But I wasn't comfortable. Not anymore. I was collecting every Sunday while they were at church or shopping. I took my walks, not for health, for preparation. I walked to the bank, to the municipal records office, to the notary's window at the post office. I asked for reprints of everything, paid in cash, gave my old address. No one blinked. No one questioned. They forgot that I had been the one who handled paperwork my entire life, that I balanced checkbooks in ink before they could spell their own names, that I could still do long division in my head, that I filed every tax return by hand until 2004. They forgot I was the one who made them believe the world was manageable, neat, safe. And now they were trying to put me away like an old receipt. So I built my case quietly. I spoke to the lawyer once a week, always from the pharmacy parking lot, phone wrapped in a tissue so I could pretend to sneeze if someone walked by. He advised me to hold steady, keep gathering, let them make the next move. And they did. 3 weeks after I found the first mortgage notice, I heard them through the wall. They thought I was asleep. I wasn't. My son said he didn't think it would take so long, that her name should have come off by now, that he was worried about the next payment, that they needed to get her moved before anything else could happen. Moved, like furniture. My daughter-in-law told him not to worry, said she'd scheduled a meeting with a specialist, said it would be cleaner if I agreed, that they'd ease her into it, and that if I resisted, there were legal steps they could take. She said it so calmly, like she was talking about planting tomatoes. I sat still in the dark and stared at the sliver of moonlight on the floor. I didn't cry, I didn't tremble, but a quiet steel settled into my bones. They were going to remove me, not with anger, not with fists, with paperwork, with padded language and second-hand smiles. They were counting on my silence, my gratitude, my surrender. They had no idea that I was already steps ahead. The next morning, I made oatmeal for the children, stirred it slowly, let it thicken just the way they liked it. My granddaughter asked me if I was feeling okay. I told her I felt more like myself than I had in years. She smiled, not understanding. She still saw me as Nana, soft, slow, sweet, a background presence. But I was no longer in the background. I was building toward something, quietly, steadily. They were planning a future that didn't include me, but I was planning an ending they wouldn't see coming, one where I would leave the house quietly. Yes, but on my own terms, and not before it belonged to no one but me. The discovery came not from a whisper or a warning, but from a printout left in the recycling bin. They'd gotten careless. That's what happens when people believe they've already won. They stop hiding the evidence. They start walking through rooms like they own every inch. They forget who's watching. The document had been tucked between junk mail and a cereal box. I saw it as I reached down to toss a tea bag into the trash. A glimpse of a logo I recognized, that same home transition company my daughter Ed mentioned once in passing. I pulled it out without hesitation. Action plan, March, July. That's what it said at the top below it. bullet points, each one a little sharper than the last. Confirm facility availability, begin medical documentation process file. For power of attorney POA, if resistance. Consult legal workaround, arrange house sale post POA filing. Target move-out date, July 15th. There it was, in black and white. Their entire plan. They weren't waiting for my consent. They weren't even pretending anymore. They were waiting for a signature or a substitute, something they could force or forge or manipulate with the right words and enough outside support. They were building a paper trail to remove me from the house I paid for. The life I built, the world I knew, all under the warm disguise of care. I smoothed the page against the table, then folded it in half and slipped it under my lie. Sure, my heart wasn't racing. It was steady, cold but steady. I went upstairs and opened my notebook. I dated the entry and wrote exactly what I saw. Then I attached the paper to the inside cover with a PAPERCLIP. After all these years, I still didn't understand who raised them. I was a woman who kept records. I was a woman who paid attention, and now I was a woman preparing her exit. That evening, my daughter-in-law knocked gently on my door, asked if I wanted to join them for a movie. She had popcorn in a bowl, wore slippers with bows. Her face was friendly, relaxed, almost proud. I told her I had a bit of a headache and would lie down. She said, of course. Take all the time I need. What she didn't say was that she'd already marked me for removal. She didn't know. I'd seen the plan. The next day, I went to the bank. I wore a scarf and long coat, even though it was warm outside. Not because I was hiding, but because I wanted to remind myself. I was still someone who could choose what to wear. Someone who could walk into a place and be heard. I asked to speak with a manager. I told her I needed to update information on a property I owned. When she pulled up the file, she frowned, said something wasn't right, that a few documents had been flagged for review. I asked her to print them all. There were 3. The first was a loan modification. Request submitted without my signature, but with my name typed underneath. The second was a notice of intent to transfer decision-making rights, citing mental fatigue and declining executive function. And the third, a partially completed power of attorney document. My name was there. A space for my signature, left blank, but already dated, already witnessed, and not by me. The room was quiet. The hum of the printer, the only sound as she stapled the pages and handed them to me. I thanked her calmly, told her I'd review them with my attorney. She nodded, and her eyes softened the way people's eyes do when they see something they can't quite fix. I walked home with the papers folded tight in my purse. That night, I sat on the edge of the bed with every piece of evidence I had, the envelopes, the emails I'd forwarded to myself from their shared tablet, the notes I took, the printouts I gathered, the phone logs from my burner. I laid them all out like puzzle pieces. And what I saw wasn't just betrayal. It was strategy. A whole system built on the assumption that I wouldn't fight back, that my mind would cloud, that my memory would fade, that I'd nod along and say yes to everything if the tone was sweet enough and the lighting dim enough. They thought they could rewrite me, that I was old. Now that old meant easy. What they didn't understand, what so many don't, is that age doesn't erase clarity. If anything, it distills it. I remembered every hour I worked to pay off that house, every bowl of rice and lentils I stretched into dinner. Every time I made do so, they could have a little more. That house wasn't just a roof. It was a monument. And now they were trying to gut it and sell the bones. I wrote one final line in my notebook that night. They built their plan on the assumption I had no plan. The next morning, I scheduled a second meeting with the lawyer. We reviewed every document. He nodded through each one and said, "This is enough." We initiated the steps. Quietly, I revoked every authorization they had, froze any modifications, filed for protective review of property rights, initiated an alert for POA misuse. I also did something else. I contacted a real estate agent, a kind man with a quiet voice and good shoes. He asked why I was selling. I told him the truth because they asked me to leave the house quietly. He paused, unsure how to respond. Then he nodded, as if he understood more than he said. We scheduled a valuation for the next week. I insisted it be done during the day, while they were out. I hadn't been back to that house since I left. Not really, but I still had the keys, still had my name on every legal page, still had the alarm code memorized. When I opened the front door again, it smelled faintly of dust and forgotten things. I stood in the foyer and let the silence settle around me like a shawl. I didn't cry. I didn't even sigh. I walked from room to room, hand brushing door frames, eyes landing on places that had once held laughter. Music. Voices that needed me. Now. It would hold something else. Freedom. I would sell it, not to hurt them, but to release myself. They wanted me gone. They just didn't think I'd go on my terms. And they certainly didn't expect that when they woke up one morning in July. They'd find the house sold, the locks changed, and the silence finally, completely. Theirs I didn't break down. The night I saw the papers, I didn't scream when I discovered their timeline. I didn't throw anything, didn't march into the living room demanding answers. The shift didn't look like fire. It looked like stillness. That's how it happens, you know? It's the real turn, the quiet becoming. Not a burst, but a calm, a knowing. Something inside you settles so deeply it stops shaking. I sat on the edge of the bed that night. In the soft wash of my lamp's yellow light, hands folded in my lap like I was waiting for a bus. But I wasn't waiting anymore. Deciding. They'd tried to make me small. They'd wrapped it in politeness and patience. But they were shrinking me room by room, till the only space they allowed me was inside their version of me, confused. Slow, grateful. But I was done being grateful for crumbs at a table I built. So I got up and made a list. Not in my notebook. That was for them. Their lies. Their movements. This was a list for me. 3 columns. What they took, what they assumed, what they don't know. The first column was short. A few sweaters, a houseplant I'd left behind, my favorite chair. The second was longer. That I'd forget, that I wouldn't. Question mail. That I'd never look up a deed. That I didn't understand loans. That I didn't know how to use a computer. That my silence meant permission. But the third column, the third was where I found my breath again. They didn't. No, I still had my copy of the title. They didn't know I still had my own savings. They didn't know I had gone to the bank. They didn't know I was talking to a lawyer. They didn't know I had options. And they didn't know most of all that I was no longer afraid of losing them, because I'd already lost the version of them I raised, my son. Once so tender-hearted he'd cry if a bird hit the window, had become someone who used words like liability. My daughter-in-law, who used to send me birthday cards with watercolor flowers and handwritten notes, now handed me dinner in containers and said, "It's easier this way." They believed their betrayal was invisible, but it sat on their shoulders. When they spoke to me, it lived in the space between their words, in the half-second hesitation before answering. In the way they avoided eye contact when I walked into the room, they thought I didn't notice. They thought the silence was mine. It wasn't. It was theirs. They couldn't look at me without seeing what they were doing. And I couldn't look at them without remembering what I'd already decided. I didn't want to win anything. I just wanted peace. So I started preparing not for a confrontation, but for an exit. There's a difference between reacting and reclaiming. I wasn't interested in drama. I was interested in freedom the week after I returned from the valuation visit. I called the real estate agent and told him to proceed quietly, discreetly. He said the market was strong. I said that was good. He asked if I was sure. I told him. I was more sure of this than anything I'd done in 20 years. That night, slept better than I had in months. The following day, I visited a consignment shop 2 towns over. I brought a few old antiques from the attic, things I knew they'd never notice missing. And sold them for enough to rent a mailbox and fund the next step. I started storing documents off-site. I opened a bank account in my own name at a small credit union with a quiet lobby and kind receptionist. I transferred just enough to make sure I wasn't trapped. Each step made me lighter. My walk changed. My shoulders opened. I said less, but I listened better. My daughter-in-law noticed, asked if I was feeling more settled. I told her I felt clear. She smiled, not understanding. There's a particular strength in clarity. Not loud, not flashy, just firm. It's the way a stone holds its shape beneath water, while everything around it rushes and changes. They thought I was soft. They mistook my silence for fragility. But I was silent because I was done explaining. They didn't deserve an explanation. They had spoken in actions. And now, so would I. On my last walk before the sale, I went back to the house again alone. I brought a box with me. In it, I placed a photograph of the kids when they were young, one of my husband's cufflinks, and the front door key on a string. I buried the box in the backyard beneath the maple tree we planted the summer he died. I marked the spot with a stone. Nothing elaborate. It's just something to say. I was here. I left something behind that night. When I returned to their house, not my home, I looked at them like I already knew how the story ended. Because I did. They told me to leave the house quietly. And I was. Step by step, page by page, but not empty-handed. It's not erased. I was walking away with the truth tucked in every pocket and a door closing softly behind me. One they would never find their way back through. The confrontation didn't happen. The way people imagine it. No raised voices, no slammed doors, no tears running down anyone's cheeks. It was a Wednesday, overcast. Quiet in that way where even the wind seems too polite to stir. They were sitting at the kitchen table. Both of them. On their phones. My daughter-in-law was scrolling with one finger, painted pink and glossy. My son was answering emails. They looked up when I came in, then quickly back down. They weren't expecting anything of me. I was background noise. I sat down across from them and laid one piece of paper gently on the table. My name. On the deed, undisturbed, current, still. Sole owner. My son glanced at it, blinked, looked again. What's this? He asked, like he didn't already know. I didn't answer right away. I pulled out the second paper, the mortgage activity with his name, the missed payments, the balance. I placed it on top of the first. My daughter-in-law looked up now too, her fingers still. I know, I said, about the loan. She smiled like people do when they're not sure how much you actually know. You must be confused, Mom. That's just paperwork we handled for. I cut her off gently. I've seen the documents. I've spoken to a lawyer. It isn't a misunderstanding. Silence. My son opened his mouth, closed it, then finally said, we weren't trying to hurt you. I nodded slowly. That may be true, but you were. Trying to benefit from me without my consent. He shifted in his chair. She didn't speak. I kept my voice level. You've borrowed against a house I paid off. You've made plans to sell it. You filed paperwork behind my back and planned to move me out of here under the language of care. He started to say something. I don't know what. An apology maybe, or an excuse, but I raised a hand. I'm not here to debate. I looked at my daughter-in-law then. Her mouth in that soft smile she always used when she wanted to win without raising her voice. I've seen the transition documents, the plan to obtain power of attorney, the timeline. You were going to move me out by July 15th. Her face didn't change. That told me everything I needed to know. It's not that we wanted to, she began. But her sentence trailed into a shrug. I leaned in just a little. Not angrily, not emotionally. Close enough to be heard. You don't need to explain. You've already said everything with your choices. There was a beat of silence. The hum of the refrigerator filled the room like a third voice. Then I laid down the last piece of paper, the notice of sale, my signature, my decision, my buyer. Their expressions changed then, both at once. Not fear, not guilt, but disbelief. Like they were just now realizing I was not the woman they'd spent the last year managing. I've sold the house, I said. To who? My son asked, his voice rising for the first time. To someone who saw its worth, I said. Paid in full. Who now holds the keys. The ones I kept, by the way, You never thought to ask?" They both sat stunned. "I didn't break the law," I said softly. "But you nearly did." He rubbed his forehead. She crossed her arms. There was something bitter in her eyes now, like I'd stolen something from her. "You went behind our art." "Backs," she said finally. I smiled just barely, "and you went behind mine. But the difference is, I never lied about who I was." My son looked at me for a long time. I wondered if he saw the woman who once stood in line with him at the pharmacy when he had chicken pox. The one who drove across town at midnight when he called from college. The one who never missed a single parent-teacher meeting, not even when I had the flu. I don't think he did. I think he saw someone inconvenient, someone who had just reminded him that quiet does not mean weak. I stood. "This won't become a fight," I said. "Not legally, not emotionally. I'm not interested in dragging anyone through mud, but I am leaving." He looked up. "Where will you go?" I paused. "Where I can be myself again." I left the paperwork on the table. All of it. Let them look at every word, every dollar. Every decision I made with full awareness, the same awareness they'd hoped I no longer had. As I turned to go, my daughter-in-law said, "You didn't have to do this." I stopped in the doorway, kept my back to them. "You're right," I said. "I could have let you take everything and called it love." And then I left. I went upstairs, closed the door to the guest room that was never really mine, and finished packing. One suitcase, one duffel, one small box of letters and photographs. I zipped everything without hesitation. Before I left, I placed a note on the dresser. Not for them, for me. You remembered. You endured. You acted. I walked down the stairs slower than usual. Let them hear my steps. My son didn't come out of the kitchen. My daughter-in-law didn't follow. It was better that way. No dramatic goodbye, just the quiet sound of a woman reclaiming her own name as she walked out the door. They had been trying to push her through for months, and this time it closed behind me, not because they shut it, but because I did. I stayed at a motel off the highway for the first 3 nights. It was the kind of place with faded curtains and a humming ice machine, where no one asks questions, and the lobby coffee tastes like it's been poured from a memory. I chose it because it was in between everything, between my old house and the life they tried to write me into. It was a place that didn't belong to anyone. The silence was different there. Not lonely, just still. For the first time in months, I didn't have to listen through the walls. I didn't have to lower my voice or pretend to nap or make myself smaller than I was. I sat in the chair by the window, legs tucked under me, a pen in my hand, and I wrote not lists, not notes for evidence, not documents, just thoughts, lines. Like, you're not a burden for needing air. You're not ungrateful for remembering who you were. You're not wrong for walking away from people who only want parts of you. The motel room had one picture on the wall, a photograph of a pier leading into a lake. It was generic, but I liked it. I stared at it long enough to realize something. I wasn't drifting anymore. I was walking with purpose. I just hadn't reached the shore yet. On the 3rd morning, I called Harold. Not his son, Harold himself. He hadn't retired, not fully. Said he liked having one last good case now and then, something to remind him of who he used to be. When I told him everything, the sale, the confrontation, the documents, he whistled low into the phone. "You handled that with more grace than most people half your age," he said. I told him I didn't want to hurt them, just to stop the harm. "That's what makes you powerful," he said. "You moved quietly, but you moved right." I met with him later that day. We sat in the back office of his home, the windows open to the sound of wind chimes and traffic. I handed over every paper, every scan, every copy I'd saved. He reviewed it all slowly, carefully. Said it would be enough to file for legal protection from any further financial claims. Said we could also notify the bank and request a formal investigation into misuse of property. That there might be restitution options if I wanted them. But I didn't. What I wanted was a wall, not to trap them out of spite, but to keep myself safe. We filed the paperwork together. He smiled when we were done and said, "You've still got a lot of chapters left." I know. I said dot, and I meant it. Over the next week, I made more calls dot to an old friend I hadn't spoken to in 6 years. June, who had thought I moved away and didn't want contact. I told her the truth. Not all of it, just enough to say, I'm still me. I'm safe now. Can we have tea? She cried. Said she thought I'd forgotten her. I told her they'd just made it very easy to forget myself. We met 2 days later in a small cafe with dusty scones and chipped mugs. She reached across the table and held my hand like no time had passed at all. You look more like yourself than you did at your birthday lunch, she said. I smiled, thinking how no one had said that to me in years. We sat for hours. She told me about her hip replacement. I told her about the motel coffee. We made a plan to walk once a week, even if it was just to the end of the block. That same afternoon, I called the real estate agent. He closed the deal smoothly. No issues, clean sale, full payment. He asked if I wanted help finding a new home. I said, not yet. I wasn't ready to own something again, but I asked if he knew anyone selling RVs used but in good shape. He paused, then said, I've got just the thing. It was parked on a lot behind a flower shop. Cream-colored with pale green stripes, a small hummingbird decal on the side. Inside, it had a little kitchenette, a fold-out bed, a skylight. I stepped inside and felt like I could breathe again. I'll take it, I said. He blinked. No questions, none that matter. I signed the papers that day, paid in full. And for the first time in a long time, I watched someone hand me the keys. That night, I sat in the driver's seat for nearly an hour before turning the engine on. Just held the wheel, touched every button, felt the soft hum of ownership return to my chest like a forgotten song. I had gathered what I needed, not just protection or proof, but people. June, Harold, not myself. People who remembered who I was. I wasn't alone. They had tried to isolate me, to scatter the pieces of me so quietly that I wouldn't notice I was disappearing. But I had gathered them back, one by one. Not with rage, not with revenge, but with presence. I had become whole. Again, by simply refusing to vanish. That's the part they never understand. That you don't need to scream to survive. You just need to remember your name. And now, it was written on a title, a bank account, a mailbox, a steering wheel, and I held every single key. The final showdown came softly, no courtroom, no gavel, no judge towering above. Just a conference table, a lawyer on each side. And the unmistakable weight of choices sitting in the space between us like fog. Harold had insisted on a formal meeting. Said if they wanted to resolve things, they'd have to do it with clarity. Witnesses. And to record my son and daughter-in-law arrived together. Matching gray tones, sharp shoes. She wore a cardigan-like armor. He kept checking his phone. They looked nervous, not because they were afraid, but because they hadn't expected this version of me. Not the one seated across from them in a navy blouse, hairpinned back. Documents stacked neatly beside a stainless steel travel mug. I didn't say much at first. Harold opened. He laid everything out. The timeline, the forged documents, the financial missteps, the unauthorized filings. He spoke calmly, factually, without emotion. That was the power of it. There was no anger in the room. Just truth. They didn't argue with the facts. They couldn't. Their names were on too many lines. Instead, my son tried a different approach. He leaned forward and said he'd been stressed. Tikkun had gotten out of hand. That he thought he was protecting me. I didn't think I'd understand all the moving parts. I let the words land, and then I answered with my own. I understood enough to raise 2 children on one salary. I understood enough to keep food on the table when your father died. I understood enough to pay off a mortgage alone in under 25 years. And I understood enough to know when I was being lied to. He blinked, and for the first time I saw it. Not fear, not even guilt, but recognition. Like he was finally seeing me as someone real again. Not an obstacle, not a task. A person my daughter-in-law didn't speak until Harold produced the final page. The letter from the mortgage company's investigation team. The one confirming that their filings had raised flags, that the bank had opened a review, that the second mortgage was in violation of several consent conditions tied to the title. She flinched. That was when I looked at her. I invited you into my family, I said with trust, and you spoke softly while arranging my disappearance. She opened her mouth, then closed it, folded her hands in her lap. Harold leaned forward, voice even. We're not pursuing charges, but any further contact related to finances, property, or decisions on behalf of my client will result in formal legal action. That's in writing. He slid a folder across the table. She didn't touch it. My son cleared his throat. Are you okay? He asked, and I could hear the hesitation, the confusion in his voice, as if he wasn't sure who he was talking to anymore. I'm at peace, I said, and I intend to stay that way. I didn't ask for an apology. I didn't demand understanding. I simply let the silence settle until it became a wall they couldn't cross. After the meeting, stood outside alone for a while. Sky was gray, the wind mild, held my papers against my chest like they were a shield. Not because I was afraid, but because I had earned every line, every initial, every legal step that said you belong to yourself. I walked to the cafe where I'd met June last. She was already there, 2 mugs waiting. She didn't ask how it went. She just passed me a warm blueberry muffin and said, "Next we find you a spot by the lake." I smiled. I hadn't told her I'd been thinking about the lake, but she knew. Friends who really see you always do. That night, I parked the RV under a stretch of sky so wide it felt like a roof made of silence. I cooked myself a small meal. Just enough. Buttered toast and eggs, and a peach I'd bought from a farm stand on the way out of town. I ate with the windows open, the hum of summer around me. No voices pressing in. And then I opened my notebook one last time. I wrote, "They tried to take the roof above me and the memory within me. But I remembered and I stayed upright." And I walked out holding the deed, the truth, and my name. Later, I got an email from Harold, just one line. "It's done. Rest well." And I did, not because they gave me peace, but because I claimed it. I hadn't yelled, I hadn't pleaded, hadn't begged anyone to see me. I saw myself. That was enough. That will always be enough. I left the city 2 weeks after the meeting. There was no note, no forwarding address. Just me, a tank of gas, and the road stretched out like a silver ribbon, soft at the edges. The RV moved slower than a car, but I didn't mind. I wasn't in a hurry. When you've spent years being silenced, you learn to savor your own direction. I drove with both windows cracked just enough to let the wind carry away what no longer belonged. I didn't pack much, a small collection of books, a few clothes, my notebook, the mug June gave me that says, "Not all who wander are lost." I kept it beside me on the dashboard, warm with coffee most mornings, just a little chipped along the rim. The first place I parked was a rest stop near a lake. Not a fancy one, just a quiet patch of water surrounded by pine and picnic tables. The air smelled like moss and the rain that had passed earlier in the day. I stepped out barefoot and felt the gravel under my feet. Solid, grounded it had been. So long since I stood on ground that was mine. I sat at the edge of the lake until the sun went down, listened to birdsong and the hush of trees. No one asked me to move. No one told me I was in the way. No one whispered about my memory or reminded me to take pills or called me brave like it was a consolation prize. I was just there, present, alive in a way I hadn't been in years. Later that night, I opened the skylight in the RV and lay beneath it, watching stars arrange themselves in quiet defiance of the world below. I thought of the house, the one they wanted to sell while I slept upstairs. I thought of the hallway, the creaky stair, the window ledge where I used to fold laundry with the sun on my back. And I smiled, because they don't own the memory. They don't get to take that. Selling the house wasn't revenge. It was release. It was the act of severing the cord they thought I would never cut. It was saying, I am not something you get to manage. I am not a guest in my own history. They wanted me to leave quietly, but what they never understood was that the quiet is where I'm strongest. I made camp near the lake for 4 days. I wrote, I read. I started stretching in the mornings again, not for fitness, but for the feeling of air moving through limbs that still remembered how to reach. On the 5th morning, I saw a woman park 2 RVs down alone, feeding a calico cat from a plastic bowl. We nodded to each other, then talked later that day about engine trouble, broken microwaves, which gas stations had the cleanest bathrooms. Her name was Lorna. She was 73 and used to teach biology. Said she'd been unclaimed by family too, but hadn't. Found that out until after they stopped calling. We shared soup that night, split it from one pot between 2 chipped bowls. She laughed when I told her my story, not out of mockery, but recognition. They think we won't do it, she said, that we'll stay quiet to the very end. I nodded. They forget that we raised the people who forgot us. We laughed together for a long time, and it felt like coming home. Over the next month, I traveled farther. Small towns, winding roads, library parking lots, lavender fields. I rode in diners, sat on park benches, made friends with women in cardigans, and nurses on night shift breaks. I mailed postcards to myself to that rented mailbox with messages like "You did it," and she remembered and still here. Still free. Sometimes I thought about them, the house, the kitchen, the soft steps on the carpeted stairs. I never thought about going back. That part of my life had closed gently. They could never say I didn't love them. I had loved them in every language, in packed lunches and hand-stitched hems, in quiet rides to the doctor, in meals reheated twice. I had loved them without needing thanks. But love does not require your erasure, and when it did, I chose myself. One morning, as fall touched the edges of the leaves, I drove up a small mountain pass and parked at a lookout point. I brewed tea on the little stove, wrapped myself in a blanket, and watched the valley below wake slowly, clouds yawning open. Deer grazing at the edge of a clearing. The hush before birdsong, and I cried. Not out of sadness, but because I was still here after. Everything, after being pushed aside, rewritten. Underestimated, after folding myself down so tightly that I thought I might disappear. I'd unfolded again, and I had done it without permission. That is what they will never understand. That I did not leave out of anger. I left because I finally understood that staying would be the real betrayal, to myself. I chose quiet. I chose peace. I chose the road and the sky and the cup of tea warming my hands, and I chose not to return. They told me to leave the house quietly, and I did. But I also left the story they were trying to write me into, and I began my own. I used to think forgiveness looked like returning, that if I could just explain myself well enough, cry at the right time, show them the contents of my heart without trembling, maybe they'd see me. Maybe they'd remember. But that's not what forgiveness is. Not always. Sometimes forgiveness is letting go without an apology. It's living well in spite of the silence. It's no longer shrinking so they can feel tall beside you. Learning to bless your own name, even when no one else says it aloud. I don't check my phone for messages from them anymore. There was a time I used to always hopeful for a change of tone, a line of remorse, even just a picture of the kids with a thought, "You'd like this." But none came. What came instead was space, and I filled it with myself. I stopped waiting for the kind of closure that only guilt can bring, because I realized something. They're not haunted by what they did, but I used to be haunted by what I allowed. And once I named that, once I said aloud to the trees, to the water, to the stars overhead, "You are not crazy. You were erased." The spell broke. They lost power the moment I stopped waiting to be seen. Now, I write letters I don't send, not to them. To the woman I used to be, the one who sat at the top of those stairs and listened to her son speak about her as if she were already gone. I tell her, "You were right to listen. You were brave to wait. You were wise to leave. You were never the problem." I wish I could go back and place my hand on her shoulder. Tell her that survival doesn't always look like screaming, that sometimes it looks like walking slowly toward the door, holding your dignity like a suitcase. These days, I walk more. I've taken to keeping small folded maps in the glove box. I like tracing rivers with my fingertip, following roads I haven't driven yet. There's something sacred about a road that isn't mapped by memory, only possibility everywhere. I stop, I try to plant something. A sprig of lavender, a seed. A sentence said aloud, like a quiet prayer to the version of me who thought she'd been forgotten. I leave pieces of myself behind, not out of loss, but proof of life. I met a woman in Montana who paints wild horses on scraps of driftwood. She showed me how to use a dry brush to make motion feel like memory. I painted one, not perfectly, but sincerely. I gave it to a little girl who was watching us with wide eyes. Her grandmother whispered, "Thank you." Tears in her eyes. I've made more connection in 5 months on the road than I did in 5 years under their roof. Because here, I'm not in the way, I'm in the world, and I belong. I think that's the word I had been starved of for so long. Belonging, they offered shelter, not welcome. Provision, not presence. They called it care, but it was containment. It's a cage made of politeness and gentle condescension. But here, with this sky above me, this road beneath me, this breath that fills my lungs without permission, I belong. No one locks the cabinets. No one corrects how I speak. No one files papers behind my back and calls it protection. I cook what I want. I sleep when I choose. I watch the moon move across the roof of my RV like it's dancing just for me. This isn't a fairy tale. It's not perfect. Sometimes the nights are cold and the roads are long. Sometimes I miss the smell of my garden, the creak of the old step, the sound of someone calling my name down a hallway that was once mine. But then I remember the creak was replaced with silence. The garden with concrete, my name with labels, like confused and dependent. So I trade nostalgia for now, and now is enough. The truth is, I am not extraordinary. I am one of many. A woman quietly rewritten until she finally picked up the pen. There are so many like me. Women who gave and were thanked with absence. Who held families together with their own unraveling. Who showed up day after day, until the family photo no longer included them. But we're still here. We're out there in RV parks on walking trails. In cafes with notebooks and chipped mugs. In bookstores buying our second lives. We've stopped apologizing for needing softness, for asking questions, for remembering what happened. And slowly the world is hearing us again, not because we raised our voices, but because we never stopped listening to ourselves. I'll keep moving until it feels right to stop. Maybe I'll buy a small patch of land. Maybe I'll open a little tea shed by the coast. Maybe I won't settle at all. Maybe this is the settlement. I don't know where I'm going, but I do know where I've been. And I know I am no longer there. They told me to leave the house quietly, and I did. But what they didn't know is that I left with everything that mattered. This morning, I woke up to birds tapping against the RV window. Not in a rush. Not in a panic. Just there, gentle, persistent. As if to say, "You're still here." I made tea without hurry, barefoot on the floor, the sky pale and wide behind the blinds. I wrapped myself in the old cardigan I brought from the house, the one they said had too many holes. Too many years stitched into it. It's soft now in the way only old fabric can be. Familiar, warm in a way memory never is. But almost. I sat by the little table and watched the steam rise from my cup. Outside, a young couple was setting up a tent nearby. Their dog ran ahead of them, wild and happy. The woman waved at me. I waved back. I don't tell people my story unless they ask. Most don't. They see an older woman living on her own and fill in the rest. Maybe they think I'm widowed. Maybe they think I'm a free spirit. Maybe they think I'm running from something. I'm not. I'm running toward myself. The version of me that used to wake before the kids and stand in the doorway of their rooms, watching them breathe. The woman who built dinner out of leftovers and laughter. It's the woman who held so much together for so long that she forgot what it meant to hold herself. I have her again now. She sits with me at breakfast. She opens maps and laughs at road signs. She reminds me which flowers bloom in August and which constellations crown the sky in November. I lost her once to obligation, to expectation, to the slow grind of being. Everything for everyone else. But not anymore. She's mine again. I thought the end of my story would be a fading out. A quiet corner in someone else's house. A routine designed by people who said it's for your own good. I thought I'd disappear politely. Like steam off a mug no one bothered to drink. But I didn't disappear. I rerouted. I reclaimed. I remembered they wanted me to fade gently, respectfully, without trouble. But I left with the deed I left with. The truth I left with my name intact, and I never looked back. Sometimes I still see their faces in dreams. My son, younger, holding his father's hand. My daughter, Law, smiling. Early days before power softened her voice into something condescending. The grandchildren, wild and small, before someone told them Nana was too much. It's too slow, too old to matter in the dreams. I forgive them, not because they've asked, but because I've released the weight. You cannot carry someone else's guilt forever. It will rot your spine. I think in their way, they loved the version of me that made no demands. The version who folded quietly into the edges of their lives. Who said thank you even when what she got was smaller than what she gave. But that wasn't love. That was convenience. And I am not convenient anymore. I am clear. I am full. I am wide as this morning's sky. I've driven nearly 6,000 miles now, through cornfields and canyons, through heat that painted the horizon gold, and snow that softened the land into silence. I've seen the ocean and the desert, slept beside rivers and under bridges, and every mile has pulled me further from who they said I was. Every sunrise has reminded me, you did not imagine what happened. You simply survived it. There is power in that. Not loud power. Not fists on tables or names and lights power, but rooted power. The kind that says, I was nearly erased and I chose to rewrite myself. I haven't spoken to them since the day I left. No calls. No letters. No emails, and I don't expect to, maybe. One day they'll wonder where I went. Maybe they'll find the mailbox empty, the number disconnected, the silence too sharp to ignore. Maybe not. That's no longer mine to carry. I leave that to the wind now. It has broader shoulders than I do. I've met women on this road who've left husbands, children, entire lives behind. Women with stories stitched into their backs like maps, each line a lesson. We trade poems and soup recipes. We sit beneath stars and talk about freedom like it's an old friend, returning after a long absence. We aren't bitter, we're breathing, and that's enough. Today, I'll drive north. There's a trail up past the tree line I want to walk. Not far, just enough to remind myself my legs still hold me. I'll take my notebook. I'll write another letter to the woman I once was. Maybe I'll leave it tucked inside a crack. In the rock for someone else to find. Maybe it will be the only proof that I was here. Or maybe the proof is this: that I didn't stay where they left me. That I didn't become who they said I'd be. That I left the house quietly. But I took back my life, and it is mine now, all mine. Now I'm curious about you. Have you ever experienced something like this? Let me know in the comments. And if you stayed with me until now, thank you. I'll leave you with 2 other stories I think you'll love.